what we stopped at was we had established that God created us as physical bodies and immaterial compartment or component of us that is divided into a soul and a spirit. And we agreed that the body includes the brain, which is considered our hardware, and that brain is provided by blood supply, and brain cells, they function just like any other organ of the body, and therefore it is bound to disturbances and conditions that are considered biological or physiological or physical. And therefore the branch of psychiatry is acknowledged, and we established that God himself had alluded to the fact that if someone is diseased, would need a physician to treat that. And also in the book of Sirach, we mentioned that that verse in chapter 38, verse 4, that says that God has created medicine from earth, and the wise man shall not abhor it, which means that he approves the treatment by medications. So that's on one end of what we discussed. The other end was the intangible part of us that takes the flavor uh, of things that are not necessarily physical, but are intellectual, emotional, and we cannot touch it. However, this is very closely engaged with the, the, the body and also to the spirit. And we gave the example of that verse, or the proof that verse in 1 Thessalonians 5:23, that where God indicates that we are spirit, soul, and body. And it implies here that he has created us as such, and he wants us to be complete and whole in all these aspects. And as we said before, we pray for these three components in the liturgy. Um, we related to that diagram as the body has the brain part of it, and when that brain functions with the blood circulation, it gives us some functions that are intangible: the mind, the emotions, the will, but also the spirit. It was the breath of life that God has breathed into this whole system to complete that apparatus, to become a spiritual apparatus, and it becomes also um, hooked with his divine infinite presence, and gives us all an immortal part, immortal character, which is transcends and outlives the the end of life, and takes that whole soul to live infinitely with God. And we will return to that part later. But to what I wanted to do today is to go zoom in, talking about Zoom, the program that we're using. So we're going to zoom in into that part on the left side of the screen, which is the connection between the body and the soul. And we're going to focus more on some of the disorders that happen due to the disturbance of that part of the system, which is the body-soul connection, where like I said before, the blood supply of the brain can go unbalanced, and some of the disorders that could happen. So we're going to address that part, and then we're going to return back later in another session to the other side of this diagram, where we have the spirit connection with the soul, and we're going to address that in the future. But for today, we want to focus on that part, which is what we call body-soul connection, the hardware-software connection that we spoke about last time. The hardware being the brain, as we looked at, and we decided that the brain has all these functions and areas. And like you see, the areas here, even though they are physical areas, but the functions of them are not physical. Like not all of them, but some of them are not physical, like the judgment, the reward, the memory. All these are not physical things. So there is a part that we call neurological part, which is the physical functions of the brain, uh, addressed by the branch of neurology. And there is the non-physical part, which is addressed by the psychology or the psychiatry department. So those are the judgment, the discernment, the reward, the memories, the thoughts, the intellects, the emotions, and so forth. So those are the ones that I want to point at today. I want to touch on practical points. How, for those of us who have disturbances on those functions that I mentioned, how to discern between whether they are disorders of the software, meaning psychiatry related or psychology related, versus those of actually not the hardware, but this would be a mistake here, versus those who are spiritual. So I want to talk, when can we call these things, these disturbances are as disorders that need treatment. So we have, those are major categories that, to be honest with you, are very prevalent. They are available in many households, even though we don't talk about them. And maybe that's why we are opening this discussion and have this month of awareness, because these conditions do exist and they are very prevalent. And even during this time of the pandemic, the reports are that these conditions are very much exacerbated and they're very prevalent. So I want to give you a brief about those titles. For mood disorders, I want to tell you that they are very common. The symptoms should be severe enough for the patient to consider that they are a disorder rather than just fluctuation of normal mood. But the way we discern that is by having a change in the previous level of functioning. So if we're so depressed and feeling down that we cannot function, then we have to raise that flag and seek help. Um, why? Because the complication of that disorder, horrible disorder, is suicide, and it's very high rate. Um, Most commonly prescribed medications, believe it or not, in the United States are the treatment of depression, the antidepressants. You can ask any pharmacist who would confirm that. But this is how depression looks like. The mood is the normal mood would be that line, straight line in the middle, and below that line going down deep with like blues, we call them, or depressed mood, usually comes with lack of interest in doing any pleasurable activities, low energy, low concentration, low self-esteem, loss of hope, helplessness, sad mood, obviously, and decreased or increased appetite, decreased or increased sleep. Also, thoughts about death, whether it is active thoughts of suicide or just thoughts about death. There is something called bipolar disorder, where you get the mirror image of depression in a different time of the year. So some weeks of the year or months of the year, you get those symptoms that I described with depression, but another months or days or weeks, the person gets the opposite, the complete opposite. A high, as someone who talks and moves fast, don't need a lot of sleep because they're full of energy and they have a lot of ideas in their minds, and they feel very good about themselves. So the exact opposite of the symptoms of depression, and they have to happen all together so that they qualify for what we call mania. And mania doesn't mean happiness or joy. No, it means actually the most common mood in mania is aggression and anger and irritability. Moving along, there is something called PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder or depressive disorder in women. Most women have, before the menstrual cycle, they have like few days of feeling down, but that's 80 or 85% of women have those two couple of days before menstruation, but 10% of those can have a full-blown depressive episode for 2 weeks every month, and that could be easily treated. So I'm raising the awareness for that. So for those of you who oh, that sounds familiar, you can contact me or someone else. Anxiety disorders are very common. They are most common mental illness in the United States. Um, the extent is 18% of the population. There are different ones, but they all have the similar um, pathology in the brain. Um, the types are called generalized anxiety, where someone always anticipates something wrong is going to happen, feeling on edge, feeling fearful most of the time. The panic disorder is where you get all of that as an attack in like boom, 5-minute attack out of the blue where you feel anxious, severely anxious, and your body starts to react with physical symptoms. You feel like your heartbeats are pumping very hard. You feel sweaty. You feel tremulous. You feel like you're gonna dizzy. Something bad is gonna happen, and your mindset tells you that you're having a physical bad attack. And most of these people run to the emergency room. Social anxiety disorder is when person doesn't tolerate being among people a lot. Specific phobia, when person have a fear of one specific thing. OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, is like fear of being obsessed in the mind with ruminating thoughts, and that compels you, the person, to do things to alleviate that, like washing hands, feeling that you're unclean all the time and you want to excessively wash your hands or check the locks for safety. Post-traumatic stress is after an identifiable stressor, usually life-threatening stressor that happens, that makes the person very anxious. This is very quickly an idea about some of the psychiatric disorders. Psychotic disorders is when the person starts to have different realities, or there is a confusion between what's real and what is unreal. So the person confuses fantasies with realities. There's a list there: schizophrenia, delusion disorder, brief psychotic disorder, shared psychotic disorders, where the person has what we call delusions and hallucinations. Delusions are thoughts that are deeply ingrained in that person's minds, that for that person is very real, but for everyone else it's false. And hallucinations are when that person have sensory stimuli that are not shared by others. So would see something or hear something or touch something or smell something that the others don't. Um, like I said, I will end by saying that all of this is still in the Lord's mind. The Lord has acknowledged that those who are well have no need of a physician, and but those who are sick. So the Lord Himself, not once it's mentioned in the Gospel, but as you see in the screen, this is mentioned in the three Gospels: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The Christ Himself, even though He was talking about Himself, He is sitting with the sinners, but he's using that analogy, proving the need of a physician. Um, a lot of us would claim that going to a psychiatrist, taking medicine for things like that, are a no-no or a bad thing or something that is against God somehow. But here God is saying that the brain is the sick person has to seek help, and as we has established before, the brain is just another organ in the body that we neglect a lot of times. And this is the verse from Sirach again that says, honor the physician in the beginning, and at the end it says, Lord created medicines from earth.